This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. My microphone is super far away because I forgot to move it. There it is. This is impressive. So, technical note, new web camera from a great little company called Lumina. I was deeply unsatisfied with the quality of the camera that I had been using. It's still slightly off center. And I realized that the camera I had been using was from the old Cameron Cowan talk show circa 2014. I think I bought that camera in 2013 when I started doing the talk show, and I quit doing, I left the business, and I had gone and done other projects and whatnot for a couple years, and then I restarted the business in the fall of 2018. And I wasn't doing video for the longest time. I didn't start doing video seriously again until this year. And in the intervening period, I just was like, oh yeah, this web camera, we'll grab it, because I don't have I have my laptop closed and on a stand because I have a big monitor. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. Like, we'll just, do that and all this type of thing. And I was kind of screwing around with the picture and the light, and nothing was really helping, and it was really confusing. And then I started to look into it and realize this camera it's ancient. There's no other way to put it. Ancient as technology goes. So I ordered this new camera. It was a little bit spendy, but it's AI powered. It has tons of stuff. I will continue to screw with the settings as time goes on, and try to make it the best that it can be. But on the bright side, it's already doing great stuff in terms of picking up more light, and is all sorts of great stuff. So I think it's I think it's going to work out. I think it's going to work out. So like I said, I'm still playing around with the settings of it all, and I'm still, kind of messing around with what I think works. And so it's going to be an ongoing conversation. So as you watch today, you might see things change and happen. Because I'm trying to dial in everything. I had a chance to use the camera earlier on a video call, and it was great, and this is great. So, yeah, so we have a lot of news happening this week. I probably have 11 stories. We're gonna have to work hard to get through it all. But yeah, it's been an interesting week in the news. A little quiet, a lot of Russia-Ukraine news. We're gonna get into that a little bit, and we're also gonna dig into debt ceiling talk, because there's still quite a lot of that, and we're kind of getting down to the wire. Zelensky was in was in Japan at the G7 summit, and was talking with world leaders um, and was chatting about weapons for Ukraine and all this type of thing. Um, the Pentagon continues their R&D project in Ukraine and finding out that their stuff is way better than anything the Russians have. All of our fears about that were way overblown. And so that continues to be a fun situation. It's been a busy day. Business wise, it's been a little bit crazy. I am currently in negotiations to potentially start working with a small press publisher for the promotion of my books. So watch this space for that announcement, little teaser. Tomorrow I will be appearing once again on the In the Name of God live broadcast, and I'll be talking about my new political theory, individual collectivism. That will be simulcast on all the Cameron Journal places. So wherever you're watching this, you can watch that tomorrow. It goes on at 6 o'clock Tuesday Pacific, so 9 in the East, 8 Central, 7 Mountain, 6 in the on the West Coast. And I'll be talking about, it'll be the first of 2 sessions where we'll be talking about individual collectivism and why we need to create systems that enable individuals to do well so that society does well, because when society does well, individuals do well. So um so that, and this obviously isn't a new idea, it's just kind of in different packaging, and we're going to get into philosophy, and Dan and Wade are going to ask a lot of questions. I might not have the answers to all of them yet. I might still need to go away and do some more homework. This is the first time I've really taken individual collectivism out for a test drive. So far it's been a TED talk. I've been talking about it. I've kind of got the basic outline of a book. But this is the first time of really taking it out and talking about it with serious people. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. And just a lot going on in all aspects of things. I apologize if you were reading the Camera Journal over the weekend. We had a little bit of a website outage. There was a technical update to some of the back end stuff that we use that makes the Cameron Journal possible, and it dumped all the data and customization, so the website was not functioning very well over the weekend, but we're all fixed up now. So I spent my Sunday night rebuilding almost the entire website from scratch. So that was fun. Not really, I'm afraid. But it was good, but definitely a struggle in terms of getting everything together and trying to put everything back the way it was and get all the colors right and everything. It was a lot. So so like I said, been a lot going on, a lot has happened. Let's dive into the news. The first story I want to talk about actually was just handed to me not an hour ago. And it's actually, breathe with me now, everybody, a Fox News story. I know, but don't worry. It's, let's get through this. So, I work with an organization called the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, and they recently had a case where they got a cross saying "Remember our veterans" with all the symbols of the branches of the military, removed from a Texas VA hospital probably a few weeks ago, I think. And they obviously, having a representation of faith like that in a VA hospital is not necessarily great if you are not a Christian or another religion or whatever have you. And so now House Republicans are complaining about it. So it says here, House Republicans are demanding that a veterans hospital in Austin, Texas, put back a cross display that officials removed from the lobby following complaints that displaying the symbol somehow violates the U.S. Constitution. Texas Republican Representative Chip Roy, along with 16 of his GOP colleagues, sent a joint letter Monday to Secretary of Veterans Affairs Dennis R. McDonough, demanding that Central Texas Veterans Healthcare System immediately return the cross, which bears the emblems of American military branches and the words, "Remember our veterans," back to its original display. The display is topped by what appears to be a bugle player, likely to represent the playing of taps at military or veteran funerals. The decision, quote, exhibits remarkable disregard for the First Amendment and hostility towards basic military history and the traditions of the United States. We call on you to immediately reverse this decision, the lawmakers wrote. Attempts to sterilize the public square, in this case a clinic that provides medical care to veterans that sacrificed for our republic, of all symbols of Christianity, flies in the face of the very founding of our nation, they said. Quote, from the Distinguished Service Cross established in 1918 to the Air Force Cross in 1960, our country has used the symbol of the cross to honor U.S. military personnel for over a century. And then it goes on to why they think that it should stay and all this type of thing. What is not being said is that it was the Military Religious Freedom Foundation was instrumental in getting it removed after only 90 minutes because it is a violation of establishment. It also, again, if you are not a Christian or another religion or all this type of thing, on government property, it's just simply not an appropriate display, especially when it's religious in nature. And the Texas Republicans can go complain all they want to. I'm not surprised that Fox News is complaining, and you can only imagine what the comment section was like. So I wanted to talk about that because I have spent a ton of time working with NAACP. I've written extensively about their organization. I've posted stories about what members of the military go through with religious pressure. Nobody serving in the military, current or former, should be pressured to observe any one religion or take on any one religion. The Constitution says Congress shall establish no religion nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. The prohibiting free exercise thereof is important because people like Congress shall establish no religion, and it's like, well, that's just a state religion. That doesn't mean we have to purge public life from religious symbols. When you live in a pluralistic republic, democratic republic, where you have multiple religions going around, if the government is holding up a specific symbol, religious symbol, as the ideal, that's establishment. Supreme Court's already said it. It's one of the reasons why we don't have prayer in schools anymore. The only recent decision where they have somewhat reversed themselves on that is in Kennedy versus Bremerton, which ironically was a case that I covered here, not on the Newshour, but on the Cameron Journal podcast, with former Air Force General, and we talked about Kennedy versus Bremerton before the decision came down, and how it would undermine school prayer. The case was about whether this football coach could go and, have a prayer with his team before or after games, and if that unfairly pressured players to pray on the field with him, and the Supreme Court decided it didn't. So there we are with that. But it is important for these public spaces to remain religiously neutral so that people don't feel like they are, in the way or anything like that, or that they are, less than because they don't worship the state-endorsed religion. So if you want to learn more about this story and more about this stuff going on in the military, I highly recommend you go visit militaryreligiousfreedom.org or mrff.org and check out the work that they're doing and learn more about how Christian nationalism is seeping into the ranks of the military. It's a big problem. Speaking of crazy Republican-y things going on, the NAACP today issued a Florida travel advisory joining various Latino and LGBTQ groups. It says here that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People on Saturday issued a travel advisory for Florida, this is from the New York Times, saying that under Governor Ron DeSantis, the state has become, quote, openly hostile towards African Americans, people of color, and LGBTQ plus individuals. The NAACP joins the League of United Latin American Citizens, a civil rights organization that issued a Florida travel warning on Wednesday, and Equality Florida, a gay rights advocacy group that issued one last month. The NAACP's travel advisory does not explicitly recommend against travel to Florida, but it urges travelers to be aware of the state's politics. And the organization said that, quote, the governor and the state of Florida have shown that African Americans are not welcome in the state of Florida. The NAACP said in a statement on Saturday that the travel advisory was in, quote, direct response to Governor Ron DeSantis' aggressive attempts to erase black history and to restrict diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in Florida schools, unquote. The advisory comes after Mr. DeSantis last week signed legislation defunding diversity programs at the state's public universities and colleges. The advisory also cited concerns with a number of other laws recently passed in Florida regarding voting rights and the concealed carrying of weapons. Mr. DeSantis' office did not respond to a request for comment on Sunday. After signing the legislation last week on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, Mr. DeSantis said that the law would ensure, quote, Florida's institutions encourage diversity of thought, civil discourse, and the pursuit of truth for generations to come. Mr. DeSantis has often spoken out against what he describes as woke indoctrination and leftist agendas in schools. It's not clear how much influence the statements will have on travel to Florida, but they demonstrate, along with the escalating disputes with Disney, how Mr. DeSantis' reliance on conservative culture war issues as he gears up for what is expected to be a presidential run was colliding with the state's signature industry, tourism. So I thought that was oh so very entertaining and oh so very interesting. Hello, welcome to the broadcast. Someone was commenting. I try to say hello to everyone. Ron DeSantis has a lot of crazy ideas about what he thinks should and should not be going on, and we know that this extends to his personal life and all this type of thing. And it's no surprise why he's in the business that he's in. And it is probably no terrible shock that he is going down this road because it defines him from Trump. But the reality is that you're getting to a place where when your main industry is tourism and it seems like people aren't welcome, it's not a great thing. Especially in Florida, you have, a lot of... Miami is very gay. Okay, Miami's very gay. There's several major LGBTQ events that happen throughout Florida throughout the year, especially as Pride is coming up. And the political environment is getting to the place where, and I've said this before, it's getting to the place where it's trying to force anybody who's not straight, white, Christian, and preferably male back into the closet behind the Christmas presents where they belong. And if you don't understand that at a fundamental level, then here is your exposure to it. It is important to understand what the culture social war agenda is. And I hear it from people who talk to me, and it's really we never had a problem with trans people or gay people, and they started shoving it down our throats. It's something where it's like there's a difference between thriving in society and being allowed to exist, right? There's, okay, we'll politely let you exist as long as you ask for no rights, don't ask for any public policy changes, stay away from any area that we don't want you in, and generally be very unobtrusive. We'll allow you to exist in our society. Thriving in society, having agency, having, being a full part of society and deciding what the future of society might look like, all this type of thing is a very different energy. And so now when you have people of color and LGBT people and all this type of thing coming out and saying, yeah, we want to have different, public policy decisions. We want to have, different policies that help us and help us thrive in society and all this type of thing. That very much changes the conversation about what we're doing and how we're moving forward as a society and how these groups are affected. So it's a difficult thing. Let's dash through a couple other stories. I have China debt coming up. We have debt ceiling. That'll be our debt segment. We have Clarence Thomas of the Supreme Court. Oh, let's start with this because we got a couple short stories and then we'll get into some deeper stuff. So, First thing is Meta was fined $1.3 billion for violating EU data privacy rules. It says here, Meta on Monday was fined a record 1.2 billion euros, or $1.3 billion, in order to stop transferring data collected from Facebook users in Europe to the United States in a major ruling against the social media company for violating European Union data protection rules. The penalty announced by Ireland's Data Protection Commission is potentially one of the most consequential in the 5 years since the European Union enacted the landmark data privacy law known as the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Regulators said the company failed to comply with the 2020 decision by the European Union's highest court that Facebook data shipped across the Atlantic was not sufficiently protected from American spy agencies. But it remains unclear if or when Meta will ever need to cordon off the data of Facebook users in Europe. Meta said it would appeal the decision, setting up a potentially lengthy legal process. At the same time, European Union and American officials are negotiating a new data sharing pact that would provide legal protections for Meta and scores of other companies to continue moving information between the United States and Europe, a pact that could nullify much of the European Union's ruling on Monday. A preliminary deal was announced last year. I imagine, based upon that from the New York Times, that fine won't go anywhere. They'll never pay anything. It'll be fine. If I were Meta, I wouldn't be too worried. It is a nice chunk of change, but given that the appeal process and there's a potential treaty in the works that would negate most of it, I wouldn't worry. While we're over in Europe, let's dash through the war in Ukraine real quick. Today, so there's a couple things going on. So one here is from yesterday morning, and it was about the F-16s to Ukraine. So one of the things they want to do is they want to send aging F-16s to Ukraine to bolster the Ukrainian Air Force. I read a very fascinating thread this morning about from a F-16 and F-15 variant mechanic who talked about why Ukraine's airfield situation is not suitable for the maintenance of F-16s, and how the training required to get the maintenance done right, because American airplanes are so delicate, as opposed to Russian MiGs that can kind of, take on more stuff, is very important. And I did not know this, but the F-16 only has one engine. Its intake is below the fuselage, and so if there's any debris on the runway, which is called FOD, it gets sucked up into the engine. Now, apparently MiG-29s have covers and things to prevent this, so they can use a wider variety of airfields. The F-16 was designed with the idea of having a nearly pristine airfield. And he was also talking about how that the maintenance can't just be slapdash, close is good enough, it has to be dead on accurate. And this is on top of the political implications of sending F-16s to Ukraine, having those possibly be entering Russian airspace. There was a headline from the Times this morning that said Ukraine had promised not to enter Russia using American F-16s. That's one thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is that also over the weekend, it says here from the New York Times, Russia's state media celebrated the purported capture of Bakhmut on Sunday, but a key leader of its months-long assault against the city in eastern Ukraine was struggling to get credit. A segment on a leading morning newscast on Sunday compared the battle for Bakhmut to the Soviet Union's major victories in World War II. A Russian fighter was shown saying he felt probably the same emotions as our grandpas did in Berlin. The anchor declared mission accomplished. But even as the newscast on state-run Channel 1 featured Bakhmut as its top story, one man went unmentioned, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner mercenary force that lost thousands of fighters during months of frontal assaults on the city, and a vocal critic of Russia's military leadership. The noticeable omission underscored the lengths to which Russia's propaganda machine has been going to hide any sign of the elite infighting or problems on the front line from the Russian people. While Ukraine's military insists that Bakhmut has not been lost, the Channel 1 newscast cited the statements late Saturday by President Vladimir Putin and the Russian Defense Ministry that both gave Wagner partial credit for capturing the city. Channel 1 also featured footage of armed men described as Wagner fighters yelling, "Bakhmut is ours." But the newscast did not mention or show Mr. Prigozhin, who was first to proclaim Bakhmut's purported capture on Saturday, in a video. In his announcement, Mr. Prigozhin stood against the backdrop of the ruined city and exorcated Russia's top general and Russia's defense minister for, quote, turning the war into their personal entertainment. So that's going well. All seems to be, yeah, that's going perfectly. Couldn't be any better. Yeah, that war in Ukraine is just, oh boy, just really, really going well for Russia. It's not working out at all. It's sad. It's quite sad. Oh, my throat's a little dry. It's been a long day. I was up early. Been doing a lot of stuff. So, we've been talking about this a little bit, but it bears some repeating. The Supreme Court situation with Clarence Thomas. Then we'll start talking about debt crises, and some economic news to wrap up the hour. So in this story we have, well, it's not a story, it's an opinion piece from Jamel Bowie. He's a very great writer. Black dude, really great. And the headline is caustic. Clarence Thomas can't undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court fast enough. Now, I forget what I was... Oh, there was a newsletter from the Times that was talking about the unhappiness in the political environment right now with the Supreme Court and its legitimacy and the ethical issues and all this type of thing. And how, this is a difficult thing. Here we go. For Republicans, the investigation into Clarence Thomas and his friendship with Harlan Crow, a Texas billionaire, are just pretext for an attack on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. Quote, "This assault on Justice Thomas is well beyond ethics," Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina said during a hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee last week on Supreme Court ethics reform. It's about trying to delegitimize a conservative court that was appointed through the traditional process. This is an unseemly effort by the Democratic left to destroy the legitimacy of the Roberts Court, he went on to say. It's put people at risk. It's put their personal safety at risk. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa accused Democrats and their allies in the liberal media of waging a crusade to threaten to pack and smear the courts. And Senator Mike Lee of Utah described the questions about Thomas's conduct as attacks that are undermining the rule of law, endangering the security of the justices and their families, and inflicting incalculable damage on our country. For their part, Democrats do not seem eager to attack or undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. Just a handful of Democrats in the House called for Justice Thomas's resignation after reports that he accepted lavish trips and gifts from Crow, and Senate Democrats have been careful with the issue. There has been no attempt to subpoena either Justice Thomas or Chief Justice Roberts, who was politely asked by letter last month to come before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and there is no indication that Democrats have the votes to pass anything like a meaningful Supreme Court ethics law. What's more, Democrats still speak as if they hold the court in high esteem. They defer to its judgments and trust it enough to think that it could, with a little prodding, handle its own ethics issues. The goal of their questions and investigations is not to delegitimize the court in so much as it is to shore up the court's legitimacy, to protect its standing in a world where most Americans take a dim view of most institutions. Republicans, in other words, are wrong. Democrats are not out to undermine the Supreme Court, but they should be. And he goes on to talk about why the court deserves to be undermined, and he finishes by saying, "No one party or ideological movement has established hegemony over American politics in our moment, but the current Supreme Court represents a coalition that has burrowed itself into the judiciary in the hope that it can reshape the political order by judicial fiat even as it loses at the ballot box." And he finishes by saying, "If the final result is a court that is much weaker than it has been in recent history, a court that can't claim total control over the meaning of the Constitution, then that is something to celebrate. The Supreme Court is imperious, a fickle friend to justice. It would be better, in the end, to remove it as much as possible from the decisions that shape our lives, rather than to leave it with a leading role in the affairs of we the people." So there's a quirky thing about the American system that is odd. So, In Germany, for example, they have a court whose job it is to interpret the German Constitution. Other nations have similar courts whose job it is to do that. The Supreme Court's impetus to do constitutional interpretation comes out of a very famous Supreme Court decision called Marbury versus Madison. And the particulars of which I will not get into, but that was where the Supreme Court began to, in its early days, this was 1802, in its early days, to establish itself as the voice of who to interpret the Constitution. The Constitution sort of gives that power to the judiciary, but it's not explicit. I would say it's an implied power. And that means a lot of especially sticky social issues that are not fun to talk about at election time oftentimes get handled in the courts rather than in Congress, where the founders would have rather had it handled. This also means that, much like Roe, a different Supreme Court decision with a different case can take away a right as fast as it can grant them. The Supreme Court got rid of segregated schools, it got rid of Japanese internment, but it just as easily could bring back segregation in schools. It got rid of prayer in schools. It could also bring it back because those are on legal precedent. It's not into law that must be changed or rethought about or reinterpreted. So the fact that we have the Supreme Court, who is the titular head of the entire federal judiciary, in this sort of dual role as chief interpreter of the Constitution, is quite difficult. It might be good to have a separate court for that. Something that is separate from criminal and other cases and all this type of thing. Do I think that's ever going to happen? No. Do I think that Jamel has the right idea of being like, well, yeah, undermine the Supreme Court and we can have a more democratic process? Possibly. The problem is the Supreme Court has always been seen as the one place where politics don't matter as much. However, as we saw during the Trump years, where they managed to get in 3 justices because Mitch McConnell held spots open, and poor Mr. Gorsuch was never even given a hearing on the Senate floor at the end of the Obama years, the Supreme Court can be incredibly political in terms of how balanced the court is and how many liberal versus conservative justices there are. So the Supreme Court ends up being a decades-long lagging indicator of American politics. So you saw out of the 80s, you had a lot of, more conservative justices, and then as they kind of cycled out, you had some more liberal justices filter in. Obama got to a point to Kagan and Sotomayor. But part of the problem is we have not had that many Democratic presidents. In my lifetime, there have only been 3, counting Joe Biden. So keeping Democrats out of the White House, as Republicans have done quite well, through the 80s to early 90s, and then through the early 2000s, and then in the mid-2010s, has made a more conservative court by nature of they've been the ones in office who've been doing the appointments of the Supreme Court. Now, if Mitch McConnell hadn't held up Gorsuch's nomination so that they could get another Supreme Court seat in the hopes that a Republican would win in 2016, it would be a different court today. But again, this is where politics and the Supreme Court kind of overlap. The Supreme Court is not supposed to be involved in politics, but it ends up becoming political, especially when you have a political party who's very much concerned with and working on controlling that institution, starting first with the electoral process and then moving into making sure their people are in the judiciary. And this is something we'll be dealing with for decades. Trump appointed, I think, 400 federal judges, absolutely packed the system. We'll be dealing with these conservative judges for decades. So let's hurry on. Before we get into debt, this was funny from the Daily Beast. two of the FBI whistleblowers that went in front of the House Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government admitted that they had taken money from a ex-Trump official named Kash Patel, and that they had gotten some donations and all this type of thing, and that they'd been given some money by this guy. Jim Jordan said, "Well, they're just trying to feed their family," and it does it matter? No. Does it look bad that two ex FBI whistleblowers took money from a Trump guy when you're investigating the quote unquote politicization of the FBI and the quote unquote um and the quote unquote, weaponization of the government? Also, yes. So I thought that was rather interesting in terms of how that has gone. By the way, while we're on the subject, nothing earth-shattering has come out of Jim Jordan and his dumb committee. Like, this is a waste of the taxpayers' time. It's as bad as Benghazi. Like, nothing came nothing came on with that whole weaponization of the government thing. If anything, all that's come out more is that you have a lot of ex-Trump people and all this type of thing very much more involved than they should be. I know we talked about it a little bit last week, but we're gonna do more of a deep dive into the Durham report as time goes on. But that was also a nothing burger, by the way. It didn't have anything that we didn't already know, including all the stuff about Peter Strzok talking to his girlfriend about not wanting to let Trump win, all the Steele dossier stuff. In fact, there was a caustic headline at Fox News when we were over there reading that story about how the Durham report points to Hillary Clinton. It's nothing we didn't already know. We know Hillary Clinton paid for Oppo research to Michael Steele, who made up a bunch of crazy stuff from MI6, and it got spread around in the media to help with the 2016 election. And I guess supposedly there's some Russia connection. So we keep these wild geese, and they never lead anywhere. There's never a smoking gun. Nothing that bad ever really has happened. But meanwhile, anytime you bring up something like January 6th, where some bad things happened and people died, and you bring up the interruption of the peaceful transfer of power, 235 years of that, all of a sudden it was like, well, that's not a thing, that's not a problem, that was just patriots doing their duty, blah, 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 blah. It's disingenuous, is what it is. It's disingenuous. And it's stupid, and I have the Durham report. I'm going to read more. There'll be more content on that. Watch this space, but there's not a lot there. Before we get into debt, including debt ceiling and China's debt issues, I found an interesting article on Bloomberg. It says almost 90 million American adults struggle to make ends meet, according to the census. It says here, more Americans struggle to meet expenses now than in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, when millions lost their means of employment. About 38.5% of American adults, or 89.1 million people, face difficulty in paying for usual home expenses between April 26th and May 8th, according to the latest Household Pulse survey. That's up 34.4% a year ago, and 26.7% during the same period in 2021. The Census Bureau collaborates with multiple federal agencies to compile the survey developed during the pandemic to collect data and measure household experiences to help inform federal and state governments. So, I guess they started on August 31st, 2020, and things kind of got real chill during 2021, and now, according to this graph, things have gotten real much worse. Geographically, it looks like people in the South, the Mid-Atlantic, West Virginia, Kentucky, and California, Nevada are having it the worst, with the kind of Intermountain West in Kansas, part of the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and New England doing better. This is also on top of the fact that for the first time since they kept records, credit card balances did not decrease in Q1. For the first time ever. Which means consumer debt is piling on, credit cards are piling on, the interest rates on credit cards are going up because interest rates at the Fed are going up, and so it's quite difficult. So I have two stories on China's debt issues, and then we'll wrap up with debt ceiling talk. So in this first one from Fortune, I found this over the weekend. It says here, in a lot of the world, the clock has hit midnight. China is calling in loans to dozens of countries from Pakistan to Kenya. It says a dozen poor countries are facing economic instability and even collapse under the weight of hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign loans, much of them from the world's biggest and most unforgiving government lender, China. An Associated Press analysis of a dozen countries most indebted to China, including Pakistan, Kenya, Zambia, Laos, and Mongolia, found paying back that debt is consuming an ever greater amount of the tax revenue needed to keep schools open, provide electricity, and pay for food and fuel. And it's draining foreign currency reserves these countries use to pay interest on those loans, leaving some with just months before that money is gone. Behind the scenes is China's reluctance to forgive debt and its extreme secrecy about how much money it's loaned and on what terms, which has kept other major lenders from stepping in to help. On top of that is the recent discovery that borrowers have been required to put cash in hidden escrow accounts that push China to the front of the line of creditors to be paid. Countries in AP's analysis had as much as 50% of their foreign loans from China, and most were devoting more than a third of government revenue to paying off foreign debt. Two of them, Zambia and Sri Lanka, have already gone into default, unable to even make interest payments on loans financing the construction of ports, mines, and power plants. In Pakistan, millions of textile workers have been laid off because the country has too much foreign debt and can't afford to keep the electricity on and the machines running. In Kenya, the government has held back paychecks to thousands of civil service workers to save cash to pay foreign loans. The president's chief economic advisor tweeted last month, "Salaries are default. Take your pick." And here's why. A lot of these, this is why China's calling in these loans. Bouncing over to Bloomberg, China's 23 trillion local debt mess is about to get worse. What happened in cash-strapped Hegang points to a long economic slog for the rest of the country. It says here, in 2021, a remote coal town in northeastern China was forced to undergo an unprecedented financial restructuring. Its struggles are an ominous sign for President Xi Jinping as other heavily indebted municipalities look to follow suit. Heigong's residents are now feeling the brunt of the fiscal clampdown. During a recent visit to the city, locals complained about a lack of indoor heating in freezing winter temperatures, and taxi drivers said they were being slapped with more traffic fines. Public school teachers worried about rumored job cuts, and street cleaners endured 2-month delays to their salaries. Outside the city's largest hospital, a middle-aged orderly wearing green scrubs and a mask said her employers unilaterally changed her work contract from a government-run medical facility to a third-party vendor, reducing benefits like paid overtime for working on holidays. Her monthly wage of 1,600 yuan, or $228, had been delayed by more than 10 days every month since late last year. Most of China, except for some big provinces out west, have a debt-to-income ratio over 120%. And that all adds up to about $23 trillion. And it goes into austerity policies and all the problems and how residents are trying to survive in this terrible crushing austerity. And it says every day a group of aging coal workers dressed in worn-out military parkas gather from dawn at a Hegang roadside. Shovels in hand, they hope to get work for the day, loading coal onto trucks and trains. One of them, Zhang, said she can earn 100 yuan, or around $15, on a good day, but more often she's lucky to just get 10 or 20 yuan for exhausting work. "We have no subsidies and no pension," said Zhang, 66, who asked to be identified by her surname. "I won't retire unless I'm physically no longer able to work." Well, that's going well. Yeah. I have been talking about, for 10 years, about China's debt issues. And that one of these days, and it's happening now, that debt's going to blow up. And when it does, it's not going to be a pretty sight. And a lot of people are going to suffer, and world markets are going to be roiled, and it's going to be the Asian financial crisis all over again. And it appears that day might be starting to be here. So, speaking of debt, though, coming back to this side of the Pacific Ocean, speaking of our own debt situation, which is not as dire as the Chinese, but we do have a debt deal situation still continuing. It says here, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and the two parties must strike a debt deal this week to avoid a catastrophic U.S. default that could happen as soon as June 1st. McCarthy said debt limit discussions Monday morning with the White House negotiators were productive ahead of a planned meeting later in the day with President Joe Biden. We can get a deal tonight, we can get a deal tomorrow, McCarthy told reporters at the Capitol Monday afternoon. But even as he expressed optimism, the California Republicans stressed that the two sides haven't yet agreed to anything. Biden and McCarthy are set to meet at 5:30 p.m. at the White House for face-to-face talks, with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warning that the U.S. Treasury may not be able to make all payments as soon as June 1st. I did not see that anything came out of that meeting, which would have happened a few hours ago, but I will keep you posted on that. Check social media for the latest on all of that stuff. So debt ceiling talks are ongoing, and China has debt issues of its own, and it's been a long news day. It's been a long news weekend. So, a lot of stories today, a lot of stuff. Hopefully this makes up for last week's short show that was only 30 minutes long because I didn't have a lot of stories. I kind of need to get things done. I wasn't feeling that great, all this type of thing. So that's all good. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. Check us out online. At Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and I will see you next week for the Cameron Journal News Hour. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.